My dear friends, yesterday was Diwali. So, although our event today is not about the festival, I must start with wishing a happy Diwali to over 1 billion Indians and Nepalese who celebrated Diwali yesterday. Not just in India, but in all the countries around the world where my fellow countrymen have emigrated and assimilated as part of the local society. Now, whilst Diwali is largely known as a Hindu, Sikh, and Jain festival of lights, or as one of my friends from Surrey like to call it, the Indian Christmas, it is celebrated in India by members of all religious faiths. Unlike Christmas, Diwali does not fall on a specific day in the Gregorian calendar, but is determined by the position of moon and falls sometime between October and November. Notably, it is celebrated on Amavasya, which is the Sanskrit word for a new moon, that is, when the moon is completely hidden. In Sanskrit, Ama means together, and Vasya means to dwell or cohabit. Now let's think about it for a second. On the darkest day, Indians light up the country with clay lamps, candles, and festive lighting. Now the naysayers would claim that this historic tradition has little or no meaning in today's time. Now I beg to differ. In today's time, we are faced with such unprecedented difficulties that it's often challenging or even impossible to maintain a sense of hope or a high morale. I interpret this festival as an annual reminder in that in the darkest of times must we be shining the brightest and be hopeful. We need to find hope when it is the hardest to go along. There may not be a natural source of light, but it doesn't mean that there is no light. We ourselves must find any and every source of light and march towards it, putting aside our deepest fears. Diwali marks also a victory of good over evil. According to ancient Hindu text, Diwali marks a day when Lord Ram returned home after a 14-year exile and after engaging in an arduous battle against evil. It is an annual reminder that often our struggles are so long and so hard that we tend to forget that there is even the slightest possibility of a better tomorrow. We simply cannot and must not surrender to darkness and must persevere on path towards light and a better tomorrow. Now, today's choral contemplation program is on the topic of yoga and religion. Our speaker for the day is Dr. James Mallinson. Now, James is a senior lecturer in Sanskrit and Classical and Indian Studies at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London. When I reached out to James to speak on the topic of yoga, I was surprised to note that he has not only spent many years in my own home country, traveling across the subcontinent, including countries like Pakistan, Nepal, etc., James has also learned and has presently a very strong command of the Hindi language. Now, he learned yoga not in a studio in England or by reading any books, but by living with yogis and monks across India. He learned yoga the way it was meant to be learned. In many of our introductory calls, he has surprised me with his depth of knowledge of my own home country. His talk today will largely center around understanding yoga as it was meant to be and not the westernized form it has taken now. I do hope you enjoy his talk, but accompanying his talk today, as always, are brilliant performances from our college choir and readings of relevance from our student volunteers.
Meditation is of two kinds, with attributes sagun and without attributes nirgun. Meditation with attributes takes different forms. Meditation without attributes is not connected with anything else. With the mind within and the gaze outward, sit up straight in a comfortable position. This is the meditation mudra, dhyan mudra, which bestows success. If, with the gaze on the tip of the nose, the yogi meditates on the self in the base chakra, which looks like molten gold, he is freed from faults. If, with the gaze on the tip of the nose, the yogi meditates on the self in the beautiful Swadhisthana chakra, which looks like a flawless ruby, he is happy. If, with the gaze on the tip of the nose, the yogi meditates on the self in the Manipura chakra, which looks like the morning sun, he can shake the world. If, with the gaze on the tip of the nose, The yogi meditates on the self in the heart lotus using varieties of breath control. He becomes Brahman. If, with the gaze on the tip of the nose, the yogi continuously meditates on the self in the Vishuddha chakra, in the throat, which looks like a lamp, he is freed from sadness. If, with the gaze on the tip of the nose, the yogi meditates on the self in the orb of the moon at the uvula, full of flowing nectar, he attains bliss. If, with the gaze between the eyebrows, the yogi meditates on the self as the unconditioned, quiescent, resplendent Shiva in the skull, he becomes Brahman. If the yogi meditates on his self as Shiva in the space which is called the Ajna chakra, then he becomes made of knowledge, Gyanmaya. If the yogi meditates on himself as omnipresent, pure, with the appearance of space, like a mass of rays of light, he attains liberation, mukti. The penis, the anus, the navel, the heart, and above that, the place of the uvula, the space between the brows, and the aperture into space. These are said to be the locations of the yogi's meditation.
A Morning Offering by John O'Donohue. I bless the night that nourished my heart to set the ghosts of longing free into the flow and figure of dream that went to harvest from the dark, bread for the hungered no one sees. All that is eternal in me welcomes the wonder of this day. The field of brightness it creates, offering time for each thing to arise and illuminate. I place on the altar of dawn the quiet loyalty of breath, the tent of thought where I shelter, waves of desire I am sure to, and all beauty drawn to the eye. May my mind come alive today, to the invisible geography that invites me to new frontiers, to break the dead shell of yesterdays, to risk being disturbed and changed. May I have the courage today to live the life that I would love, to postpone my dream no longer, but do at last what I came here for, and waste my heart on fear no more.
Hello, my name is James Mallinson. I'm delighted to have been invited to give this talk for Somerville College Chapel. I'm a historian of India, working primarily through texts, in particular Sanskrit texts, and my work for more than 2 decades now has focused on the history of yoga. So it's yoga that I'm going to be talking to you about, in particular yoga's relationship with religion. This has been quite a hot topic over recent years, particularly since yoga has become this sort of huge global phenomenon that it now is. People take different approaches to the subject of yoga's relationship with religion. You know, there are certain Hindus would claim that it's essentially Hindu and that anyone else practicing it is appropriating it in some way. Others would support this argument. There's certain sort of evangelical Christian traditions and some Islamic traditions as well today, they would argue that practicing yoga in some way turns you Hindu, will make you Hindu, and that therefore they say you shouldn't do it if you're a Christian or a Muslim. And then there are others, and this is what the angle I will be taking today, drawn from the historical sources that I study, who say that in fact yoga practice is independent of any particular religious tradition, and that anyone can practice it. Yoga, what is yoga? I mean, one could define it in various different ways, and I've devoted chapters of books to this very question. But I think in addressing this question, I understand yoga to be a formalized spiritual discipline which is aimed to lead to some form of emancipation. I mean, of course, that's a very broad definition, but within the Indian context, we start to see formalized yoga, and that term itself starts being used. It's a very polyvalent term in Sanskrit, but it starts to be used to denote a stratified, structured spiritual practice in about the 5th century BCE, before the Common Era. People will argue that it's found in the Rig Veda, for example, Hinduism's oldest text, which dates to probably 1500 BCE. But that's not really true. Certain sort of metaphors, for example, that are found in the Rig Veda, certain concepts do then resurface in later yoga texts, but there's certainly no yoga-like structured spiritual practice taught within the Rig Veda. So, as I said, it's at about in about the 5th century BCE that what we might recognize as yoga first starts to appear, and it's in an area of northern India. I've got a few pictures I'm going to show you during this. Hopefully, I can access them now. Yeah, here we go. Oh yes, that's working well. So there's an area here called Magadha, this region of northern India, which was a sort of hotbed of kind of spiritual development in the 5th century BCE. And in fact, a lot of the concepts and ideas which we associate very closely with Hinduism and Buddhism as well appeared during this period. So concepts such as karma, the idea that your actions now have a direct effect on what happens to you subsequently. This gets properly formulated in this period. I mean, there are traces of that in the earlier traditions of the Vedas and so forth, but what is absolutely new is the notion of reincarnation. Okay, so that after you die, you get reborn, and what you're reborn as is defined by your previous karma. Okay, and associated with this is the idea that constant, repeated rebirth over thousands or millions of lifetimes is a bad thing. Life is essentially suffering. It's frustrated desire, it's pain, it's disappointment, and so forth. So the obvious corollary to this, or the obvious cure for this, is enlightenment or liberation, which is release from this permanent cycle of dying and being reborn. And in this region here in Magadha, it seems to have been a sort of a hotbed of different religious practitioners trying to answer this question of how do we get off this permanent, well, hopefully not permanent forever, but this currently constant cycle of rebirth. And there were lots of different answers arose to this question. And the most famous answer of all is the one given by the Buddha. So it's in this region at this time that the Buddha lived, and then from him obviously Buddhism grew to be this hugely important, influential world religion. We also find at the same time other religious traditions in our sources that we have for the period. So the next biggest is Jainism, the Jain religion, which is a more I mean, I'll come back to this, but Jainism sort of a more ascetic approach to answering the big question of how does one get enlightened? How does one stop the suffering of eternal rebirth? And then there are kind of lesser traditions as well. There was all these, in particular, the Pali canon of Buddhist canonical texts has a lot of, we can glean a lot of information from those texts about the milieu in which the Buddha lived and studied and taught. Now, so among those answers are things that we would recognize as yoga, in particular that one needs to control one's mind. And there are various ways put forward of doing this. Of course, within Buddhism, the most famous is meditation. But the Buddha, he when he's telling his life story, he goes around trying all these different methods that people are up to in Magadha during this period. So he does, not only does he practice meditation, but he practices some quite severe forms of asceticism, and these are recorded in particular in Gandharan art. So from just under 2,000 years ago in far northwest India, we find these statues of the fasting Buddha. And it's some debate that traditionally it's thought that Buddha rejected extreme ascetic practices such as fasting and standing up for long periods or holding painful postures, and I'll come back to that. But in fact, it's not so clear, because some of the earliest reports of the Buddha's teachings that we have, which come in Chinese translations, they do not have the passages which we find in other tellings of his life in which he rejects these practices. Normally it's understood that he tries all this stuff and then says, no, this is no good. It hasn't got me anywhere. I'm going to sit under the Bodhi tree until I get a result, and then he gets enlightened. But in fact, in these early Chinese translations, this sort of ascetic practice is seen as just a stage on the path. And in fact, yoga, as it's explained in various texts from this period onwards, the Mahabharata, so India's great epic, has a lot to say about yoga. Its 12th book, the Shanti Parvan, has a section called the Moksha Dharma Parvan, which hasn't been studied very closely, but that gives a lot of instruction on yoga. And during this period, yoga is really intimately entwined with asceticism. The word in Sanskrit is tapas. The root tap means to heat the body. And these various practices, in combination with what we might recognize more clearly as yoga, such as meditation, these practices are all done in tandem. And the Jains, I mentioned the Jain tradition earlier, they famously sort of undertake these really tough austerities, standing up for years on end. They understood this as a means, by not moving, then you don't acquire any new karma, because karma literally means action. Okay, so you're not doing any more action. But also some of these traditions understood that by doing this kind of severe penance, or tapas as it's called in Sanskrit, as I said, you burn up your past karma. Okay. And in fact, so during this period, there weren't, nowadays yoga is most closely associated with sort of gymnastic contortionist postures and perhaps dynamic movements as well. Well, dynamic movements don't appear in the textual record until 200 or 300 years ago from now. So this period, absolutely not. Anyone doing yoga, any bodily position they would hold for long periods. And at this time, still the bodily practices were seen as methods of mortifying the flesh rather than cultivating the flesh, as we might understand it now. And in fact, perhaps almost certainly our earliest kind of outsider's report of Indian ascetics was from Alexander the Great. So he reached the far northwest of the subcontinent in about 325 BCE, is it? And then he, among his various adventures, he meets with a couple of groups of ascetics who are doing these, amongst whom are some doing these sort of torturous practices. They're said to hold really difficult postures in the hot sun all day long. It's not depicted in this painting here from the 14th century, but it's a sort of well-known event with Alexander meeting what called the gymnosophists, the naked philosophers. But as I said, it's not until much, much later that yoga becomes, the physical methods of yoga become about cultivating the body and using it as a tool for spiritual advancement. In the intervening years, yoga techniques are pretty quickly taken on within sort of more main, within the Hindu tradition. So we have, as I mentioned, the Buddhists and the Jains and these other lesser sects, our Jivakas, doing these kind of practices. And around the same time, it seems that certainly practices of meditation were taken on within Brahmanical, Sanskritic, what we would now call Hindu traditions. Of course, the term Hindu doesn't really come into popular usage until about 200 years ago. Before that, there's lots of disparate traditions within Indian religious practice. So yes, already, we can see that yoga appeared as the result of dialogue between lots of different traditions. And then, as I mentioned, about 1,000 years ago, well, I'm not sure if I mentioned the date, but it's about 1,000 years ago, and this is what my recent work has focused on, and this has only recently become clear to me. But about 1,000 years ago, there's a big change in the way the body is understood in yogic practice. And I think, I'm not sure exactly where all this has come from, if it just appears spontaneously. There's certainly some influence, in fact, from China. There are sort of earlier references to Taoist practices, which seem to, certainly Taoist principles, which then have started to appear in the kind of Sanskrit texts that I work on, that appear from about the 11th century onwards. So it's not until the 10th or 11th century that we get our first references to the kind of postures that we might today associate with yoga, in particular postures that can't be held indefinitely. Okay, and in this early period, perhaps there's still some connection between them and tapas. It's not made, although this posture, the one I'm showing you here, is called the name is there at the end. This is the peacock posture. So amongst its benefits is said to be being able to sort of cure problems with the stomach, to burn up poisons within the stomach, because obviously the peacock is able to eat snakes and scorpions and so forth. But still, it's not a particularly spiritual end. And this is another point I'll make. I mean, I'm talking more about postures than the tradition would warrant, in fact, because postural practice is really quite a relatively unimportant part of yoga practice. It's almost entirely seen as leading up, as preparing the body for the higher practices of breath control and then subsequently meditation and so forth. I mean, there are some exceptions which appear, as I say, together with these postures at about 1,000 years ago. There are some physical techniques which are said to bring about self-realization, combined with controlling the breath. There are certain esoteric methods that are, it's often said that the point of these techniques is to make the breath enter the central channel of the body and then rise upwards, taking the vital principles of the body, bringing it all together and raising it up to the head, and that will effect liberation. So there's this new kind of understanding, this bodily understanding of how one brings about liberation, in which the body is used as a tool. And we see this appearing, as I say, it's about 1,000 years ago, and it starts appearing in text quite, there's a sort of slow trickle for 200 or 300 years, and then we get a rush. And around the same time also we see, so this is something actually part of my recent research project, a really lucky, exciting discovery, this gate in Gujarat near Baroda in sort of Western India. And I went there wanting to look at reliefs on this part of the gate. But then I and my colleague, once we were there, we noticed that up in the sort of, what would you call it up here? It's not quite the eaves, but this part, were all these depictions of yogis doing various sort of more contortionist postures, such as a headstand and so forth. And this made them, in fact, by about 300 years, the earliest such depictions. But it's still only 800 odd years ago. Okay, so these postures only start appearing then. Now this gate, the depictions on it, one would say, were Hindu, because they're forms of the primary gods who are shown lower down on the gate are associated with the Hindu god Shiva. but it was patronized, it was paid for by two Jain merchants, so that's a different tradition. And then if we look at all the texts that start appearing at this time, we see lots, as I said, suddenly over the course of a few centuries, 20 odd texts on physical yoga practice appear. And it's basically every single, well, not every single one, but a large number of the Indian religious traditions of that time start to teach physical yoga practice and frame it within their own traditions. And in fact, another sort of exciting discovery I've made recently in my work was that the earliest text, the first text to teach physical yoga practice, this text called the Amrita Siddhi, was written, this is the oldest manuscript, a 12th century manuscript of it, and through close reading of this, we've been able to establish that it was written by Buddhists, by Tantric Buddhists. And similarly, there are Jain texts appearing, and then lots of different traditions of what we would now call Hinduism during this period produce texts on physical yoga. One of which is a tradition of followers of Vishnu, and the text is, who's another of the, you can be either a follower of Shiva, a Shaiva, or a follower of Vishnu, a Vaishnava. That's kind of big distinction within Hinduism. And this Vaishnava text, the Dattatreya Yoga Shastra, says very clearly, if diligent, everyone, even the young or the old or the diseased, gradually obtains success in yoga through practice. Whether a Brahmin, so sort of high caste, an ascetic, that's a sort of professional renouncer, professional monk, we might say, a Buddhist, a Jain, a skull bearer. This is a sort of archetypal extreme tantric practitioner, or a materialist. Now, these are, in Sanskrit, they're known as charvakas. To some extent, they're straw men. It's not clear how much or whether even they really existed, but they're like the ultimate materialists, the ultimate sort of eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. There's nothing more going on. There's no afterlife, there's no soul, there's nothing. It really doesn't matter what you do. Yet this text will say that even for them, yoga is going to give them some kind of benefit. Okay, because it goes on to say, if you're wise and endowed with conviction and constantly devoted to your practice, you will obtain complete success. Success happens for he who performs the practices. How could it happen for one who does not? Okay, so this is it's stated very clearly here. It really doesn't matter what religion you are. What one might say, the materialist thing is interesting as well, in that really all yoga texts do presuppose the idea of reincarnation, karma, and that the ultimate aim of practice is to get off that cycle. Although the materialist doesn't even believe in those things, so it's not quite clear how that would fit in. But to some extent, to subscribe to a yogic philosophy, one might argue that you need to believe in those things. But this text, it seems to override even that. Okay, so that's my, that's really what I wanted to say. Subsequently, yoga does develop. The yoga that we see today is quite different from what yogis were doing then. Particularly, we see a rapid development over the 20th century. The primary propagators of which were Hindu, Brahmin yoga teachers, yoga gurus, particularly in South India, who, with great sort of innovation and entrepreneurship even, they kind of, onto their traditional yoga practice, they tagged on elements from this new world of kind of this new global health movement that was going on all around the world. So they, since the early 20th century, they incorporated things like sort of Swedish gymnastics, I think, and certain bodybuilding techniques from America, and even aspects of British military drills. The British soldiers were in the area and they had their training routines. So it seems quite likely that some of the standing poses, for which we have no textual or material precedents, that they were brought in at this time. I think I can stop the share now. And yes, but we do see, and scholars, particularly my colleague Mark Singleton, has written about this, and people resent it and think, oh, they're saying that yoga was made up, in the 20th century. It's not true at all. these Indian gurus very cunningly crafted in to make yoga sort of palatable, more palatable to everyone. But we do see some developments prior to this within the Indian tradition. We see some dynamic movements appearing and so forth. But again, it's always been across a wide spectrum of religious traditions. Islam, also the Mughal emperors were some of them were very interested in yoga, and in fact, we owe the production of the oldest known illustrated manuscript of yoga postures was commissioned by Prince Salim in 1602, and he went on to become the Mughal Emperor Jahangir. So, yes, to summarize, yoga is a method of cultivating the body and the mind in order to attain higher mental states, ultimately aiming at liberation from the suffering of existence. And throughout its history, it's been practiced by a broad range of traditions, and its proponents would confidently argue that it can be used by anyone at all to enhance their own spiritual practice. Thank you very much.